right, now let's move to Unit 10 in your theory book, which is the dominant 7 chords. You've been playing these, you just maybe don't know the theory or the structure behind them, and so today we're going to talk about that in this book. Don't get intimidated by the analyzing page because it's easier than it looks. I kind of went over it and I'll explain it to you a little bit. So dominant 7 chords are different from a regular chord, or I'm going to talk about 7th chords in general because the dominant 7th chord is the most commonly played 7th chord, but we can build a 7th chord on other chords of the other places in the scale. So just to understand the structure of a 7th chord and what's happening with it is important. So if you remember when we talked about triads, which you might not have, so I'm just going to review this part, but I'm going to just use a F major chord for our sample here. So we talked about that. Here's our root note, and our first note above that is a third above our root note, and this note here is a fifth above our root note. So let me hold it a little closer so you can see what I wrote, the third and the fifth. All right, and that's the most common way we play our triads, 3 notes, and then we oftentimes, as we've talked about, the inversions where we might take a note and move, say we move the F to the top and keep the A and the C. We have a first inversion chord. But let's talk a little bit about a 7th chord. And what happens is we have a third above, a fifth above. To make it a 7th chord, we are also going to add a 4th note to the chord, and that's the interval of a 7th above the bottom note, which is why we call it a 7th chord. It's not rocket science. So when we play our cadence, when you do this for me, one thing about 7th, dominant 7th particularly, but 7th chords for a pianist, oftentimes we leave one of the notes out, and that's what's happened when we do our cadence. We leave out one of the notes. We always keep that 7th because that's what changes it and makes it sound like it's different than just a regular dominant chord. If I'm going to use a dominant chord for a sample, which I am, because that's what we're going to be studying in your lesson today. But again, you can, anytime you add a 7th above a chord like that, you can make any chord into a 7th chord. And then the other thing that's a little bit different about this, and let me move the camera so you can see my hand. And the 7th chords, normally you can have a major 7th chord. So if I'm going to do, let's do it in our C chord. And so here's our triad, and I'm going to make it, if I'm going to make it a 7th chord, so what I've done is I've added a third above my root note, a fifth above my root note, and then I went to a 7th above my root note. This is what we call a major 7th. I'm going to see if I can move my fingers so you can see. Not that we would play a interval like that, but I want you to see which notes I'm playing. And when you add a major 7th on top of a triad, it's called a major 7th chord. Now our dominant 7 is built with not a major. You probably thought, well, that sounds kind of strange or unusual, different. We don't necessarily play those major 7th chords as much unless maybe we're playing something modern or jazzy or whatever. But what we do play a lot is what we call the dominant 7, which means instead of a major 7th at the top, I'm going to make a minor 7th at the top. So see, I've just lowered that 7th a half of a step, which makes it a minor 7th. And then that way, if I have my root, my third, my fifth, and my 7th, oh, now it sounds like a chord that I play a lot. And when we change it into that inversion from our cadence, this actually, I made a dominant 7 chord on a C, which would be the dominant of the key of F. But if I'm in the key of C, and so we'll work with the dominant 7 in the key of C is going to be built on the dominant note. So we're going to go up to our 5th note, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it's built on the key of, or the note G. So my triad's going to look like this, G, B, D. And if I add a minor seventh above that, a major seventh, of course, would be the F sharp. But if I'm going to do a dominant 7, I'm going to make that a minor 7th. And that is the chord that you play when you play the C cadence for me, this C grand cadence. So let's look at how that's structured. We don't normally play it like this. Like if you're playing the C triad, I don't have you jump up and go like this to do the dominant 7, do I? We try to find those common tones of the chords like we talked about in the cadences. And so when I'm in C, this is where when we play them, we leave out one note. So it's spelled a G, B, D, F. But when I'm going like this, I'm going to keep the F because I need that 7th to make that the 7th chord. And I'm going to just move my thumb down a half a step to get the B, and we end up leaving out the D. We could go like this if we wanted to, and that's the full 7th chord. But we pianists so often leave out one of those tones from a 7th chord. So, your job, the first page is not going to be too hard. They've given you the scale of a particular key. They're showing you where the dominant note is because they've got the 5-7 underneath there. They want you just to build that dominant 7th chord. Now, because you're doing a dominant 7th chord, you need to check and make sure that you have a minor 7th on the top. So it looks to me like you don't have to really do much altering with, that's just a little bit of a hint. You don't have to do much altering of the top notes. What I do is I would try to write them and build them first, and then play it and see if it sounds like a dominant 7 chord to you. Then on the second exercise, which is on page 35, this is where you're going to go hunting them down in the music. And actually, the first line should be pretty easy for you to figure out because it's the chord with the 4 notes. 4 notes stacked on top of each other. But then as you're going down, this is another one of those times where you remember how I've told you where you kind of try to smush them together and line them up to see when a chord is broken over a couple of beats. Or you're going to notice in the one that's called the arabesque, the 3rd line down, one of the notes for the chord is in the right hand. So I need you thinking all of the notes that you're seeing where that chord is happening. So your job is to find the chord and circle it and then label it. So, and then you can, if you'd like to try, these pieces are a little bit hard to be playing if you want to, but you could try to put the notes together of the chord. Like if I'm going to do that one, the first chord in the first line is a dominant 7. So you can circle it and label dominant 7. You don't need to label what name of the chord it is, like that's a D, dominant 7. You just need to write dominant 7. So hopefully that's pretty self-explanatory. Don't get frustrated, and if they feel like they're a little too hard on the analyzing page, just bring it back with you next week and we'll do it together. So I don't want you to feel overwhelmed or intimidated by it, but think about you're going to be a chord detective and you're looking for dominant 7 chords on that second page, page 35, and just see how you do with it. And I did give you the hint that sometimes that 4th note is going to be found in the right hand. So when you put the 2 hands together, then you're going to end up getting the full chord. So have fun with that.